Well, friends, it's a great delight and a privilege for me to be with you today. Last year at this conference, I spoke about militarism, empire, and the economics of American empire. And this year, I've been asked to give a more rollicking talk on American history, politics, theology, and current events that set a frame for the conference. Well, I'm happy to try. But I do think that we need at least two frames to make sense of our current situation. Like it or not, we always live in a 4-year frame marked by the presidential elections. And we have a tremendously important one coming. But to make sense of our current situation, we also have to fold the past 4 years into the past 30 years. That frame is still the Reagan era, which is still going on. That's where I'm going. And I'm going to take the risk of speaking plainly about things political. I'm slightly unnerved that we're in the sanctuary this year. I was picturing that other room, but hey, it's too late now. So, all right. 4 years ago, we seemed to take a shortcut to some kind of national redemption. The same nation that enslaved African Americans until 1865 and imposed a vicious, century-long regime of vicious segregation upon them was about to elect an African American to its presidency. The same nation that elected 12 slave masters to its presidency elected a president whose wife was a descendant of American slaves. The same nation that never would have elected a veteran of the civil rights movement to national office fulfilled some of the nation's most idealistic hymnody. The same nation that prattled about its exceptionalism and superiority made good on some of its claim to being exceptional. The same nation that made USA synonymous with imperial smashing in Iraq and torturing prisoners in Guantanamo made a bid to dramatically change its international image. We elected an inspiring, eloquent, dignified, reflective type who understood very well that his candidacy offered and rested upon a series of shortcuts. Politics is always about power, and only sometimes is it about social justice. It has a relation to redemption, the healing of life in the world, only through its connection to social justice. The Obama movement of 2008, though long on redemptive aspects for a political campaign, wrought nothing like redemption for centuries of U.S. American slavery and discrimination, and it did not change the fact, one iota, that African Americans are subjected to unemployment, imprisonment, at bad schools at far higher rates than other groups. Even as ordinary politics, the Obama campaign was a shortcut. Otherwise, Obama would not have been compelled to play down the ideals, memories, and struggle that tied his campaign to the civil rights movement. And otherwise, it would not have mattered so much that Obama's many political talents include his Oprah-scale capacity for making white Americans feel good about themselves and their nation. Obama was only the third African American to serve in the U.S. Senate since Reconstruction, and he had been there for only 3 years when he ran for president. He skyrocketed to national prominence and then the presidency on the strength of his once-in-a-generation talent, intelligence, self-confidence, and Oprah-likeness. In the Senate, he pleaded with supporters to give him time to accomplish something before they talked up a run for the White House. Michelle Obama was adamant on that theme. All was to no avail. The vast crowds of mostly white liberals and moderates who packed into his speaking engagements could not wait for him to run on his record. Since Obama had planned to run all along to run for president anyway as soon as possible, he had only to change his mind about when it was timely to do so. One kind of shortcut, an early run for the White House, led to another. Electing Barack Hussein Obama to the presidency fulfilled much of America's idealistic rhetoric about itself. Unlike any president before him, he was already an historic figure on his first day in office, and he bore the hope of being a transformative one. Favorable reviews of this country soared by 30 to 40 points across the nation after he was inaugurated. That has no precedent in this country's history. But Obama is a figure of protean irony and complexity. He wrote a lengthy autobiography in his early 30s, yet he's short and guarded on what makes him tick. He's decidedly introverted, yet in public settings he has an extroverted charm that is not forced or phony. He's audacious about himself and his career, with enormous ambitions for his presidency, yet he governs with deep caution, even timidity at times, even as he pushes for huge, risky, historic things. He's disciplined to the point of having disciplined even his feelings. He is almost eerily self-possessed, more comfortable in his skin than any president since Reagan, who, like Obama, was sometimes described as an actor portraying a politician. Reagan was more complicated than he seemed. Obama is obviously complicated, which unnerves a lot of people. Yet his blend of informality, centered ease, reasonableness, and personal guardedness epitomizes the style of sociability that's prized in American business class culture. He developed his affable cool in places, Indonesia and Hawaii, where being affably cool helped him get along, negotiating his outsider status. He'd barely been elected president when he had to start governing. And he was in full governing mode before he was inaugurated, pushing a huge stimulus bill that he had to sign, that he wanted to sign on his first day in office. A month after he was inaugurated, he signed 7 landmark bills at once. The largest tax cut for the middle class since the Reagan administration, the biggest infrastructure bill since the Eisenhower administration, the biggest education bill since the Johnson administration, the biggest anti-poverty and job training bill since the Johnson administration, the biggest energy bill ever, and huge investments in housing and scientific research. But he wrapped all of this stuff together as one bill to ensure that everything passed. And he settled for a smaller stimulus than was needed without fighting about it publicly, which was a sign of things to come. Had he pushed these initiatives separately, he would have received more credit for them. To him, it was more important to prevent layoffs immediately and to revive the economy as quickly as possible. Obama pushed through the best anti-poverty bill in 40 years, which he played down because drawing attention to it might have jeopardized it. Today, millions of people are not in poverty because Obama expanded the earned income tax credit. But he was afraid that if he drew attention to it, to what that meant, that people voting on this thing would not respect voting for something that lacks lobbying power. Then he pulled off a colossal anti-poverty reform by attaining health coverage for 34 million people, which he rarely mentions today, because this achievement has become politically toxic. He defied his entire senior staff by rolling the dice on national health insurance, an issue with forbidding politics and a record of 7 presidential failures. I believe that Obama made a serious mistake by going for health reform in the way that he did. He excluded single payer as something not worth discussing, and he bailed out on the public option without risking a single speech or fight for it. But for all that he got wrong in this area, it says something terribly important about him as a moral being that he risked his presidency to gain health coverage for tens of millions of poor and vulnerable people. By the end of his first year in office, progressives were angry that he eased off unemployment spending, he abandoned the public option, and he escalated in Afghanistan, while conservatives and many independents were appalled that he stepped on the Keynesian gas, rescued General Motors and Chrysler, and asked Americans to extend health coverage to the poor and vulnerable. A year later, after Democrats were routed in the midterm elections, progressives were furious that Obama extended the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy, albeit in a hostage situation. The following year, he disastrously capitulated to Republican extortion on the debt ceiling, agreeing to spending cuts that slashed social programs and federal agencies in exchange for averting a federal default. By the time that he allowed Republican extremists to take his administration and the country hostage, he had enormous problems with his liberal base and special problems, shall we say, with much of the country, all on top of inheriting the worst economic crisis since the 1930s, the two longest wars in American history, and a cyclone of national debt caused by the economic crisis, the wars, and the Bush tax cuts. Well, it certainly didn't take long to see what Obama's special problems are. More than 1/4 of the American population, when polled on such questions, claims to believe that Obama is a radical anti-American socialist who sympathizes with Islamic fundamentalists who want to impose Sharia law throughout the world. In some polling, 1/3 of Americans have tagged Obama as sympathetic with Islamic radicalism, and over half have tagged him as a radical socialist. In a nation where such stunningly preposterous beliefs are professed on this scale, Obama pays a steep price for representing the USA better than it deserves. His election set off a howling alarm of anxiety and fear for Americans who simply could not see him as an American leader. Before he was elected, there was already a best-selling literature portraying him as corrupt, alien, mendacious, anti-American socialist and elitist, all of in which he covered up his ties to radicals and plotted to destroy America with every waking breath. This was the one part I wasn't quite ready to write for when I started writing this book, since I hadn't actually read all this conspiracy literature, and it was a blood-curdling experience when I finally did. Accusations of this sort heated up the campaign rallies in the closing weeks of the 2008 campaign. After he was elected, the conspiracy blogs and books got even more unhinged. Within weeks of his inauguration, "I Want My Country Back" became a staple of Republican rallies. The placard version featured an image of America's first black president, just in case anybody needed an interpretation. Normal political trading stopped with the coming of Obama. Notwithstanding his pleas for civility and political cooperation, and notwithstanding that the nation was in the midst of an economic crash, Republican leaders spurned any pretense whatsoever of working with the new administration to solve the nation's problems. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell was adamant that Republican cooperation with Obama would not be tolerated. His top priority was to take down Obama. The stimulus bill was the first test of that resolution. Obama had been in office for 4 weeks when the stimulus bill went through. We had lost 3 million jobs the year before. We had lost 741,000 jobs just in the month that Obama was inaugurated. Virtually every economist said that we needed a stimulus to save the nation from reliving 1933. But the stimulus bill got 0 Republican votes in the House and 3 in the Senate, all of which were very expensive. Somehow, it was horribly wrong to save the nation from crashing into another depression. On the basis of that utterly absurd argument, the Tea Party exploded into being and won a huge political windfall, which has made the Republican Party more extreme than ever. In parts of the country, the Tea Party is simply the Christian right under a different guise, and in other places it nudged aside or blended with the Christian right. The Tea Party rings the alarm about something terribly real: a national debt that has increased by over $500 billion each year since 1933 and now equals the size of the entire American economy. Getting control of the debt problem is imperative for this country. But the debt exploded as a consequence of George Bush's tax cuts and wars. Cutting spending in a recessed economy is counterproductive, as Franklin Roosevelt proved in 1937, and the debt problem as a whole is a byproduct of tax policies and economic policies that have fueled massive structural inequality since the early 1980s. And so, to make sense of where we are today, we have to hold in view the past 30 years. For the past 25 years, the best-selling books about economic globalization have told us to just forget about trying to change the system. Tom Friedman, a celebrant of the second wave, calls it turbo-capitalism. In the academy, we call it neoliberalism, but by any name, economic globalization, the integration of national economies into the global economy through short-term capital flows, direct foreign investment, flows of labor and technology, has simply flattened the world, as Friedman says. In a flat world, You either compete successfully or you're run over. According to neoliberals, global capitalism reduces national politics to minor tweaks. There is no third way in political economy anymore. There isn't even a second way. Any nation that wants a growing economy has to wear a one-size-fits-all golden straitjacket that unleashes the private sector, minimizes government, eliminates tariffs, deregulates capital markets, and allows direct foreign ownership and control. Neoliberals routinely exaggerate the futility of attempts to channel economic forces. Contrary to the story that they tell about the 30 years we've just lived through, the United States did not ensure its prosperity by donning the golden straitjacket and relinquishing its manufacturing base. From the late 1940s to 1975, productivity and wages soared together in this country, which created a middle-class society. Meanwhile, there were no bank crises, as New Deal reforms kept commercial banks out of the investment business. But wages flattened in the mid-70s and productivity just kept soaring. The rich got richer in the 80s and 90s while everybody else fell behind, taking on debt to keep from drowning. During this period, nearly every manufacturing-oriented society outperformed the U.S. in income growth and did so with more equitable distributions of income and wealth. In the 1980s, the U.S. cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28% and cut the capital gains rate from 45% to 20%. That was a revolution. That is a blowout for politically engineered inequality. Then the global integration of two radically different models of growth. Debt-financed consumption and production-oriented export and saving created a wildly unstable world economy featuring asset bubbles and huge trade imbalances. First, the U.S. hollowed out its industrial base that paid decent wages, providing incentives to firms that made things to make them elsewhere. Then it rang up enormous trade deficits that left the U.S. dependent on China to finance its debt. Then the economy cratered after the debt resort reached its outer limit in the housing market and the mortgage bubble burst. We were told that governments were just passé in the age of globalization. But when the housing market crashed, these same supposedly obsolete governments coughed up $13 trillion in 2 months to save the system from itself. The housing crash started with people who were just trying to buy a house of their own, who had no concept of predatory lending, and who had no say whatsoever in the securitization boondoggle that spliced up various components of risk in order to trade them separately. It seemed a blessing to get a low-rate mortgage. It was a mystery how the banks did it, but this was their business. You trusted that they knew what they were doing. Your bank resold the mortgage to an aggregator who bunched it up with thousands of other subprime mortgages, chopped the package into pieces, and sold them as corporate bonds. Securitizations and derivatives were and are just great at concocting extra yield, and especially at allowing the banks to hide their debt. Broadly speaking, a derivative is any contract that derives its value from another underlying asset. More narrowly, in our context, it's an instrument that allows investors to speculate on the future price of something without having to buy it. Today, speculators are driving up the price of oil because the Middle East could explode if Iran is attacked, and there's a gusher of money to be made if one makes the right bet. Credit default swaps are private contracts that allow investors to bet on whether a borrower is going to default. 12 years ago, that market was $150 billion. Today, it's $70 trillion. And that's the heart of the meltdown right there. AIG's derivatives unit was just a huge casino selling phantom insurance with virtually no backing that now we all have to pay for. Speculators gamed the system, and now the big banks are fighting every reform in the Dodd-Frank bill. This year, speculative corporate debt in this country is going to explode as the reckoning for high-risk loans, bonds, and leveraged buyouts transacted 5 to 7 years ago is going to occur. In the bond business, this is called a maturity wall. Last year, over $40 billion came due for junk bonds that were sold before the credit crisis hit in 2007. This year, that number is going to soar to 170 billion. Next year, it will be at least 220 billion. The year after that, it will be over 350 billion. This coming avalanche of over $750 billion of speculative debt was created just like the mortgage crisis, with CDOs that sliced and diced corporate loans, and all of it is going to come through as a time when, as we surely all know by now, the U.S. is going to have to borrow another $2 trillion to finance its own debt. Another credit crunch is coming. And at the moment, the European Union is teetering on the verge of a systemic collapse. In this country, the big banks are still holding about $2 trillion of toxic debt. But their bailouts have made them feel better. Their profits are way up. And today they're spending $50 million per quarter to obliterate the few things that did get through in the Dodd-Frank bill. Today, 7 banks control 66% of the nation's assets. 15 years ago, that figure was 18%. That's the path we're on. A staggering concentration of power that has turned the big banks into giant hedge funds. 2 years ago, we had a chance to break up the mega banks, thanks to Ohio Democrat Sherrod Brown. The Brown-Kaufman amendment to the Dodd-Frank bill would have allowed no bank to risk more than 3% of the nation's GDP or hold more than 10% of the nation's total insured deposits. In the Senate, that amendment won 30 Democratic votes and 3 Republican votes, despite failing to win the support of the Obama administration or the Senate Democratic leadership. Brown-Kaufman would have passed if Obama had supported it. According to him, he opposed it because he believed that the Volcker Rule was a better way to restrain the speculative excesses of the banks. But then we didn't really get the Volcker Rule either. In 1999, the Clinton administration teamed with Phil Gramm to tear down the Glass-Steagall wall separating commercial and investment banking. That opened the door to the mega bank mergers and empires of the Bush years. It was a big deal when Obama announced that he supported Paul Volcker's proposal to reinstate the wall between commercial and investment banking. The federal government provides deposit insurance and other safeguards to ensure that we have a stable banking system. These privileges were not created to give unfair advantages to banks operating hedge funds. Banks should not be allowed to speculate with cheap money that the government safety net provides. The current system allows banks to make trades conflicting with the interests of their own customers, which has fueled a riot of speculation. The ostensible purpose of Wall Street is to raise money to finance making things in the real economy. But CDO deals are not investments. They don't create any actual bonds or mortgages or add anything of value to society. They are pure gambling on whether somebody else's bonds will succeed. They're like side bets at a casino, except the Federal Reserve, in this case, is protecting these bets. According to the SEC, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and other firms have looted their own customers by creating derivatives that are designed to fail and then betting against them. The Volcker Rule was designed to undo all of that. This was not mere technocratic tinkering. This was using political power to change the system. But in the end, the Dodd-Frank bill could not pass without the vote of Scott Brown, who gutted the Volcker Rule, demanding exemptions for trading and treasury bonds and anything backed by government-backed entities. As always, these exemptions led to others, and today, the Volcker Rule is shot full of holes. There are some good things in the Dodd-Frank bill. It requires most derivatives to be traded on a public exchange and cleared through a third party. It established a new consumer protection agency and authorized regulators to impose higher capital reserves. These were very significant victories over an overwhelmingly better funded opposition, outnumbered by like 50 to 1. But Dodd-Frank is riddled with poison pills and loopholes, especially exemptions for foreign exchange swaps and pension funds and carve-outs for corporate users of derivatives. It relies very heavily on the Federal Reserve, which of course is friendly to the big banks. It doesn't require higher capital reserves. It doesn't abolish gambling with CDOs. It takes a pass on too big to fail, which makes the mega banks too big to be regulated too. And now Wall Street has gutted Dodd-Frank on the Volcker rule, debit card fee caps, and oversight of complex derivatives. Simon Johnson, until 4 years ago, was chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He argues that the finance industry has simply captured our government. During his early career at MIT, he tried to be skeptical about this, but then he went to the IMF and he got a close look at the symbiotic relationships between the world's economic elites and its governments. In this country, he says, it goes way beyond mere access or even collusion. In this country, the two career tracks of government and high finance are simply melded together. And that is problematic when the oligarchy screws up and the economy implodes. When the IMF enters the scene of a crash, the economic part is usually pretty straightforward. Nations in crisis are told to live within their means by increasing exports, cutting imports, and breaking up bankrupt enterprises and banks. Every country in the world that is not the USA would get that prescription. But the US controls the IMF. It has a powerful and very well-connected oligarchy, and it pays its own foreign debts in its own currency. So our recovery began by paying off Wall Street, and President Obama simply came into the middle of a deal. South Korea and Indonesia in 1997 had terrible crashes. Malaysia had one in 98. Russia and Argentina have had recurrent crashes. Then we had the meltdown of 2008. All these crashes had a crucial thing, the most important thing, in common. A financial oligarchy that rigged the game in its favor, built an empire on debt, overreached in good times, and brought the house down on everybody. When the house collapses, elites do what they always do. They take care of their own. To get a different result, a nation has to take control of the problem and break the grip of the oligarchy. Otherwise, you just muddle along in a lost decade of your own, which just further entrenches the oligarchy. Obama was co-opted on that issue before he began by supporting the Paulson Plan. Then he appointed as Treasury Secretary the very person who cut the bailout deals and arranged the megabank mergers. To a considerable extent, he has replayed the debates of the Clinton years over how much a slightly liberal, mostly centrist Democratic administration should be able to accomplish in a nation that self-identifies as 20% liberal or progressive, 35% conservative, and 40% moderate. Obama is vaguely liberal-leaning in Clinton's fashion, and he has energized the same right-wing noise machine that constantly accused Clinton of fraud, murder, drug running, and treachery. In some ways, just in some ways, the things that the right has made up about Obama are not quite as bad as the things they made up about Clinton. But hardly anyone thought that Bill Clinton was better than we deserved. Clinton was a skilled politician, long on charm and cunning, who did not suffer from having stirred messianic fantasies. And the right stuck mostly to criminality fantasies and making up things about him. Obama, much more deeply than Clinton, has anguished many of the very people who believed most in him. Many of us wanted him to take a stand and fight on at least one or two major things. A second stimulus, the mega banks, the public option, or getting out of Afghanistan. Repeatedly, he surrendered in the third quarter or punted on third down or whatever sports metaphor you prefer for this objection. Conciliation wasn't merely his default mode, it was his chief operating mode. Yes, he is predisposed to the role of the mediating reconciler who leads the country beyond its divisions. He got to be president by persuading independents that a likable type like himself could actually inspire cooperation across party lines, get people to work together. He wanted to be the Reagan of his party, a forward-looking optimist who changed the course of history. He wanted to do it by winning independents and Republicans to his idea of good government, just as Reagan won over independents and blue dog Democrats. Getting people to like him had always worked for Obama, as did his trope about America not being divided between blue states and red states. There is only the United States of America. But Republicans opted wholly for obstruction. In December 2010, when Republicans coerced Obama into extending the Bush tax cuts, Obama did not demand to dispose of the debt ceiling in exchange. He assured at the time that Republicans would surely be responsible when the debt ceiling came up. Well, that was spectacularly not to be. The following August, after Republicans took the nation hostage over a debt ceiling vote, Obama did not invoke the 14th Amendment or even threaten to do so. One act of anguished capitulation led to another. Every week on the lecture trail, and these days, every day on the radio, I meet progressives who are demoralized and or infuriated by Obama's performance as president. They insist they will not work for him again or even vote for him. Many of them have signed petitions saying as much. They are finished with Obama. The Occupy Wall Street movement is teeming with them, and often they assume that I agree since I've been deeply involved in Occupy and I'm known for criticizing Obama's policies. But my friends are overlooking that many of them played a disastrous role in the 2000 election, that their charge of betrayal is exaggerated, and that Obama, in many ways, is America's most progressive president since FDR. Electing a more compelling human being to the White House is not a possibility in this country. If there had been a Gore administration, the U.S. would not have invaded Iraq. President Gore would not have showered the rich with tax cuts they don't need. He would not have doubled the U.S.'s debt. He would not have let the oil companies devise America's energy policies. The left liberals who sat out the 2000 election or that supported Ralph Nader had ample cause to be frustrated with Clinton's legacy and put off with Gore's candidacy. But the difference between the Gore administration that should have been and the Bush administration that occurred were enormous, vastly outstripping all the reasons that progressives gave for spurning Gore. As for betrayal, this charge registers surprise or double dealing. But Obama has advocated the very policies and governed in the very manner of liberal-leaning moderation that he espoused throughout the 2008 campaign. He didn't have a single risky position in his campaign agenda. His opposition to the Iraq War played to his favor in the Democratic weeding out process, and he had committed himself to it long before he'd become a national figure. On everything else, he took slightly liberal positions, and he evinced less fighting spirit than Hillary Clinton. Progressives who campaigned for him had a saying on this topic. Do you remember this? Which we often muttered off camera, until finally Henry Louis Gates said it for the record, that Obama's only radical belief is that he can be elected president. But way too many people imagined that they were electing Martin Luther King Jr. to the presidency, which then set them up for a mighty disillusionment. Obama didn't promise to get out of Afghanistan. He promised to escalate there. He didn't promise to scale back the military empire. He promised to expand the army and emphasize emergency warfare and counterterrorism and shift the military away from preparing for World War III. He never promised to break the banking oligarchy or to create a public bank. He didn't claim that he would fight for social justice causes. He mostly emphasized getting folks to work together. For a while, he debated on whether to advocate a gas tax, but he decided about halfway through the campaign that no, that was going to be too risky. He supported a public option in health care, but very quietly. And for most of the campaign, health care reform was only a secondary issue for him. The two biggest examples of betrayal that one might cite, I hear this every day, are his capitulation on the Bush tax cuts for the rich in December 2010 and his subsequent months-long capitulation on spending cuts tied to the debt ceiling. In the former case, Republican leaders told him they would not allow extensions of unemployment compensations or the middle-class tax cuts if he did not cave on tax cuts for the rich too, so he caved. Then Republican leaders turned a mere formality, raising the debt ceiling, into a massive extortion, threatening default on the national debt, which played out so dramatically and in a way that's hard to swallow last summer. Any progressive case for Obama has to bank on his commitment to limit the damage from his own concessions, especially his cutting Medicaid last March to get a budget deal, which is morally indefensible. I mean, it's the usual beltway resort, bash poor people first, and that is what we did. Any progressive case for Obama has to bank on his commitment to limit the damage of that concession and to redeem the promise of his presidency. I believe this promise is still in play because he is singularly gifted and he has historic accomplishments to his credit to build upon. Achievements that deserve much greater recognition and respect. I've already mentioned a few. Enacting a historic stimulus package, expanding the earned income tax credit, stabilizing an economy that was spiraling into a deflationary abyss, saving General Motors and Chrysler, making an enormous gain toward universal health care, and attaining a halfway decent financial reform bill. In addition, he abolished the U.S.'s use of torture and the CIA's secret prisons. He made an historic outreach to the Muslim world. He forced the insurance companies to stop excluding people with pre-existing conditions and to stop dropping people when they get sick. He withdrew American troops from Iraq exactly as he promised. He ended the Pentagon's don't ask, don't tell mistreatment of gays and lesbians in the military. He terminated the Justice Department's legal challenges to the Defense of Marriage Act. He blocked Republicans from eliminating federal funding for Planned Parenthood. He suspended deportation proceedings against illegal immigrants lacking a criminal record. He has supported family unity and immigration policy, interpreting family to include the partners of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, and he has represented this country with consummate dignity. Obama is a pragmatic, liberal-leaning centrist who prizes collaboration and accommodation, and a big-thinking, ambitious type who wants to leave the largest possible legacy while governing cautiously while taking a few risks. He advocates and exemplifies the communitarian approach of pulling people together to advance the common good. He hopes that he'll inherit a less obstructionist opposition if he wins a second term. He'll be a lame duck. The Tea Party, hopefully, will fade, and more Republicans, perhaps, will accept him as a legitimate president. Perhaps something closer to normal politics may be able to resume. But the big issues that loom ahead have to be fought over. Breaking up the megabanks, scaling back the global military empire, lifting the cap on the Social Security tax, adding tax brackets at the upper end, abolishing fee-for-service medicine, building a clean energy economy. Since the debt ceiling debacle, Obama has belatedly committed his presidency to social investment. But actually doing it will require more fighting than he waged on anything in his first term. For 2 centuries, we've been debating in this country different visions of what kind of country we should want to be. The first is the vision of a society that provides unrestricted liberty to acquire wealth. The second is the vision of a realized democracy in which rights over society's major institutions are established. Both of these visions are ideal types, deeply rooted in U.S. American history. Both of them have limited and conditioned each other in the U.S. experience. But in every generation, one of them does gain predominance over the other, shaping the terms of debate and possibility, and telling the decisive story of its time. Today, the Republican right is preaching a very aggressive version of anti-government ideology. The story of our time, in this view, is that a great people is being throttled by a voracious federal government. Americans are overtaxed. Government is always the problem. Somehow the federal government caused the financial crash. We have a debt crisis because we have too much government, and cutting taxes again, especially at the upper end, is always in order. The Tea Party movement is overwhelmingly white, middle class, and either middle-aged or elderly. It thrives on a deeply felt dichotomy between the deserving and the undeserving. At the grassroots level, much of this movement is not hostile to Social Security or Medicare, unlike the professional ideologues that are exploiting the Tea Party movement. Conservative activists are quite certain that they deserve their own Medicare and Social Security. But they are outraged that what they consider undeserving people get benefits from the government. They deeply resent losing their racial privileges. In their version of the American dream, there is no such thing as the common good. There is only the sum of individual goods, which many people do not deserve. The anti-Obama literature seethes with resentment that white liberals coddled an undeserving Obama into Columbia and Harvard, financed his political career, and fawned over him all the way to the White House, where he betrays America's national interests and slathers the undeserving with government benefits. These resentments and this ideology are far from new in U.S. American life. But they have no standing whatsoever in the social ethical teachings of the ecumenical churches in this country. Here we begin with the recognition that we owe obligations to each other and that Scripture teaches a preferential option for the poor and oppressed. Here we recognize that there is such a thing as the common good. And when the sum of individual goods is organized only by capitalism, it produces a common bad that destroys personal goods along with society. I have 4 points to make about that. 1, Americans are not overtaxed. This year, the total tax burden reached its lowest point since 1958. In 1999, Americans spent 28% of their income on federal, state, and local taxes, which was the usual amount going back to the early 1970s. Today, that figure is 23%. As a percentage of GDP, American taxation is at its lowest level since 1950, 14.8%. 2, this is how we got in debt. If we had stuck with the Clinton tax rates, our national debt today would be minimal or non-existent. Our nation's debt exploded because during the Bush years, we cut the marginal rate in capital gains taxes without paying for either. We established a drug benefit that we didn't pay for either, establishing the first entitlement in American history, lacking a pay for, and we fought 2 wars that we didn't pay for. These expenditures doubled the nation's debt in 7 years, and that record keeps growing, keeps mounting. It accounts for over 3/4 of the new debt that has accumulated during Obama's presidency, even though I hear on the radio every single day that this is somehow Obama's debt. Most of the remaining new debt is cleanup for the financial crash. Today, the wealthiest Americans pay income taxes at Mitt Romney's rate, 14%. Investment managers earning billions per year are allowed to classify their income as carried interest, which is taxed at the same rate as capital gains. Constantly, we are told that the investor class would lose its zeal for making money if it had to pay taxes on its actual income. But friends, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. No investor passes on a promising investment because of the tax rate on a potential gain. A tax system that serves the common good would have additional brackets for the highest incomes, as the U.S. once did. It would have a bracket for $1 million earners and a bracket for $10 million earners and a bracket for $100 million earners and so on. It would lift the cap on the regressive Social Security tax, taxing salaries above $110,000 per year. It's utterly absurd that somebody making $1 million per year in this country pays no more into Social Security than somebody making $110,000. 3, a federal budget is a moral document. I heard a magnificent sermon on that very text, on that very point, at this conference last year. And he just walked in 5 minutes ago. If we scaled back America's global military empire and reinstated a progressive tax system, we could eliminate the entire federal debt by 2021 without cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, or research. A morally decent tax and budget plan would tax capital gains as ordinary income. It would cap the benefit on itemized deductions at 28%. It would tax U.S. foreign income as it is earned. It would eliminate the subsidies on oil, gas, and coal companies. These are not radical proposals. We'd still be way below European levels of taxation. All of it together merely, mildly restores the principle that people should pay taxes on the basis of their ability to do so. 4, tax rates are not the most important factor contributing to economic growth. Creating a healthy and productive workforce is far more important than the fluctuations in tax rates that we debate in election years. Educating the workforce for 21st century jobs and investing in research and technology are far more important. Developing a strong infrastructure and saving for investment are at least as important as tax rates. Today, the economy is sluggish because of weak consumer demand caused by stagnant wages, job uncertainty, and the ongoing ravages of the mortgage disaster. Mitt Romney's answer is a staggering 20% tax cut. And to avoid quadrupling the national debt, he embraces the Ryan plan, which savages Medicaid and Medicare. Obama, by contrast, is talking about tax fairness and creating an infrastructure bank. That is the beginning of a real answer, though merely a beginning. We need to renew this country by making massive investments in a clean energy economy. Labor costs, equipment costs, and the cost of capital will never be lower than they are today. The U.S. has underinvested in infrastructure, education, and technology for decades. A national infrastructure bank, once created, would get serious money plowed into infrastructure rebuilding on an ongoing basis. If we can spend trillions of taxpayer dollars bailing out banks and eating the toxic debts of AIG and Citigroup, we ought to be able to create good public banks at the state and federal levels to do good things. Public banks could finance startups in green technology that are currently languishing. They could provide financing for cooperatives that traditional banks spurn. They can be financed by an economic stimulus package approved by Congress, or by claiming the good assets of banks seized by the government. There are usually 2 or 3 every Friday, or both. Or they can be established at the state level. Today, the only state in this country that isn't reeling from the credit crunch, North Dakota, is the only state that has its own bank. North Dakota has its own credit machine, which makes it less dependent on Wall Street than the rest of the country. Recently, the state of Washington established its own state bank, and today there are over 20 states that have significant movements to establish a state bank, including Massachusetts, Illinois, Michigan, Virginia, Missouri, New Mexico, Vermont. New York will be last, of course. If these movements succeed, that will be a huge step in the direction of economic democracy. Obama still has an essentially progressive vision of the presidency that he wants. There's still time to redeem the promise of the 2008 election, which is to put an end to the Reagan era. To fulfill that promise, Obama has to overcome his own cautious, over-accommodating temperament, and progressives have to believe it is still possible. Our faith traditions are not relevant in the sense of teaching a theory of politics or economics. Jesus didn't talk about the things that we talk about in social ethics: proximate means and ends, theories of justice, calculated consequences, defending structures of justice. But our faith traditions impel us into struggles for social justice, and they hold us there, whether or not we succeed. That is their relevance. To love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself is the motive force of the struggle for the flourishing of life. Love makes you care, makes you angry, throws you into the struggle, keeps you in it, helps you face another day. It helps you hold in view the big picture, the kingdom of God, which isn't our production. The kingdom or commonwealth of God is comprehensive and multidimensional. It's the heavenly realm and the divine spirit that enlivens every human soul, and the building of a beloved community on earth, and the eschatological not yet that pulls us into the future and toward the end of history. The commonwealth of God is something in which all of us have a tiny, partial, wonderful, mostly unheralded, sometimes painful, always grace-filled role to play. We're not in control. It's not up to us to fulfill God's will for the world. In drawing closer to God, we're thrown into work that allows others to share in the harvest, and that's enough. Nobody can say if our efforts are going to make a difference, but that's all right. But the biblical imperative to pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desires of the afflicted is utterly certain. The Bible just resounds with it. After all our struggles have ended, it is the ever-gracious God of glory and love who will make something of them. We need new forms of community that arise out of but transcend religious affiliation and culture and nation. If those of us who are Caucasian, or mostly Caucasian, as in my case, fail to interrogate white supremacism, a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what is normal, we will resist any recognition of our own racism. If those of us who are male fail to interrogate our complicity in sexism, we will perpetuate it. If those of us who are Christian fail to repudiate anti-Semitism, Christian supersessionism, and Christian exclusivism, we will perpetuate the evils that come with them. If those of us who are heterosexual fail to stand up for the rights of LGBTQ individuals and communities, we will have an oppressive society and church. If we swear our highest loyalty to our nation, we will perpetuate U.S. American imperialism. And if we sit out the next election, we are going to get a government that privatizes Social Security, replaces Medicare with a voucher, reduces Medicaid to block grants, busts public unions, and gives yet another whopping tax cut to corporations and the wealthy. You have to have a certain stubbornness and moral outrage to hang in there against a national myth that opposes the common good and a financial oligarchy that is the most powerful force in our nation's life. But if the stubborn types can build on what Occupy Wall Street has started, we might actually, in fact, I believe we can, build something better. Thank you, friends.